Welcome to week 13. So this is where the week 13 and week 14 will be your final project. And I'm going to show you an example of a research proposal as well as what it'll look like in its final state. So over this week and next week, you'll work on your proposal and also your final project. Now, because these are both tied together, you can produce as much or as little of this on the first week, with the exception of the first two sections of this document. You have to do that for the first week. You'll see the green line where I'll put the stopping mark. At that green line is where you can stop if you'd like to on the first week 13, and then week 14 you can finish the rest of it up. You may want to knock out a little bit more of the document if you know a little bit like the data set which you're using, you've got the idea as far as the type of fields you're going to select, etc. So here's just an example. Let me run you through it. So this would be like the final report would look something similar to this, but we'll use this to start off the research proposal. The required sections based off of the CRISP DM format. First of all, you're going to have an introduction. Tell us a little bit about what your project is going to do and what is the specific research question that it's trying to address. That's very important. Secondly, talk about the business understanding. What's the implication of the research? How it's going to be used inside of industry, the importance of understanding the factors for the research. Third is going to be data understanding. Discuss which data set is being selected and why. For our example here, I'm going to use the Titanic data set. I would ask that nobody in their final project use Titanic, Iris, any of the basic data sets which we use inside of the course. There are lots of data sets available out there on Kaggle, and hopefully by this time you've selected a data set and you're starting to think through which data sets you want. But please do not use the Titanic data set. Do not turn in a copy of a report that is identical to this. Okay, data understanding. Then the next part is data preparation. Outline the steps you're going to take to pre-process and clean the data, what missing values, outliers, and consistent data, how you handled those. That's going to be important. The EDA, so the results of the EDA. Remember, we've talked in the course about pandas profiling and some of the other tools that are going to help you do that. What's some of the key insights you learned from just the initial analysis of that data? And then the modeling piece of it. As you actually built data models off of this, what did you kind of learn? What's the data set? How did you develop that data set? That's what you're going to talk about in modeling, followed by evaluation, deployment, and results. Evaluation specifically, you're going to be looking for the predictability of this data set. What did you find? What was the interpretations of those findings? Deployment, this is going to be more hypothetical because you're not actually going to deploy this, but what would be the steps that you would take in order to deploy? And then finally, the drawing conclusions. What are some of the other things that you would look at? So did it address your research question? What would be some future research which you could base off of this and talk about the suitability for addressing the problem? Documentation. You won't sit there and build a whole lot of visualizations and other things, user guides, etc. But you'll just want to have a little bit in there about what kind of documentation you're going to add to your project, or that the results of your project. How would you present that back out? And then finally, ethical questions or ethical concerns. If your data set has ethical concern, you definitely want to note that in this section. So for example, we're talking about the Titanic data set. How could that be used? How could that be used unethically? What controls would you put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen? So those are the essential sections. So for week 13, you're going to have to come up with your research question. And in this case here, I'm going to discuss what factors influence the survival rate of passengers aboard the Titanic. This is very standard boilerplate. You're going to find a version of this somewhere out on the internet, multiple examples in Kaggle using something similar to this. So it should be very familiar, but it just explains the Titanic situation. It explains the reason why this would be an interesting thing to go and research. Data understanding, this is specific parts of that data set. So we know what the Titanic data set is, we know what the fields are, and why that's important to me. Here is the green line, and so that's where you would stop for week 13. If you would like to continue going, That's great. That'll just continue to kind of knock out the stuff which you're going to have to do for week 14. I will continue down through the document just so you can see the entire thing. Data preparation, this talks about different things such as how I'm handling missing values, how I would deal with outliers, what features I would want to have in it, such as this one here is talking about the passenger titles, such as Mr., Mrs., Miss. What variable transformation I want to do, if I'm going to encode any categorical variables such as gender and embarked. Data split, if I'd want to evaluate it, split it into the training and the tests data set. Standards, there's some standards out there for how you would split this data set. Again, this is a kind of a smaller sized data set, so you're not going to be able to split the Titanic data set into 10 different sections and have something relevant that you can use. So it's going to be more of like a splitting into just a simple training, test, validation, maybe 3 different data sets out of that, or maybe even just a training test data set out of it. Some of the EDA that I would do in this, descriptive statistics, maybe some univariate and bivariate analysis, maybe multivariate analysis. So primarily I'm thinking more of the univariate type analysis, what one specific factor, but you want to go through some examples maybe of looking at, well, why did you choose a particular one over another? And then the visualizations such as scatter plots would be something I would absolutely use with this particular data set, but I list a couple of examples here for you. On the modeling piece of it, which type of modeling would I want to select? This one here kind of screams logistical regression, maybe some support vector machines, maybe some gradient boosting included with that, but you'd select which kind of model you'd like to do this. Again, I'm thinking more binary classifiers. Survive, did not survive would be a relevant type 1. So that's kind of going more towards a regression type solution. Talk about the data splits here, talk about what kind of model training and tuning process we go through. Depending on the model selection, obviously, that could be more or less complex. The model evaluation, how did you evaluate it, what specific guidance, and again, all of these will be tied back to your modeling choice. If you did multiple models, how did you compare different models? If you did an ensemble model and you wanted to try to put several models together, what was kind of the results of that? And looking at interpretability and feature importance pieces of it. These would all be potential things that you could consider. Now also understand the complexity of the assignment. You've probably been looking at your data. Hopefully you've been considering your data for some time, but this is just a couple of weeks in order to do an assignment. It's not, 6 months, a year in order to do an assignment. So you don't want to spend too much time on building out a whole bunch of different kinds of models. If you build a single model, that would be sufficient for the course. If you build a couple of models, you want to do an ensemble, knock yourself out. Again, the more you kind of produce as part of that, the instructor will go back and it will grade that pieces of it. It may enhance your learning. You may want to try something out there as far as an ensemble model or several different kinds of models, comparing the results against it. But with an assignment that's basically 2 weeks in duration, understand you're not going to have a lot of time in order to build an endless number of models. And that's kind of understood in this process. What kind of evaluation you did, if you looked at performance metrics such as ROC curves, area under curve, if you were looking at confusion matrix, if you did a cross-validation, such as a k-fold cross-validation, if you're looking at comparative analysis, multiple models and checking metrics across multiple models, if you looked for signs of overfitting or underfitting, so example, if you used the iris data set, you're probably going to have an issue with overfitting. And what kind of limitations and assumptions you made as part of the model. This is probably the most important part of this whole section. What kind of limitations, what assumptions did you make? Because even if you may have been just a little bit off on your interpretation, by putting your limitations and your assumptions in there, that will help the grading of it and the understanding of it to understand, well, this is your base of assumptions that you based it off of. Next is deployment. So again, you're not going to have time in order to deploy this to production, but you'll want to put in there a few things about what kind of things would you do in order to deploy it. Now this goes completely crazy, and it talks about like API development against the models. Obviously with the Titanic data set, you wouldn't do anything that radical, but with your data set, this may be relevant. You may want to say, yeah, I put an API in there because I can see this being leveraged by a number of different applications, for example. User guides and documentation are something that I would include in just about every data science project, as well as ethical concerns and governance. Those are two really big ones right there that you should have in your final conclusions. Um, Speaking of conclusions, the next one is the results of it. What did we learn as part of it? And so here you've seen the Titanic data set before, and these kinds of results are very consistent with that particular data set, such as age, socioeconomic status, demographic factors, such as women and children being first for the evacuation process. This is what you really learned from this study. And so yours is going to be different, obviously, than the Titanic data set, but that's where you document what you learned out of it, and then the presentation piece of it. What kind of presentation would you have? So if you have something that's a one and done type of a thing, it's probably going to be more of a project report. If you have something that's going to be a predictive model for financial information, for instance, that may be something that you'd want to set up on a regular basis with dashboards and visualizations. You don't have to build those dashboards and visualizations, but you could just reference, this is what I would do next with that section. That's what this is going to be about, as well as any kind of code documentation. Again, maybe a sentence or two about what you're going to do as far as documenting your code, user guides, and stakeholder engagement. So I will leave a copy of this presentation out in the material for this week so you can see it. By all means, feel free to use this as a template. Feel free to take from this the pieces of it that you think would be valuable for your particular project. But remember, this has pieces that are wrote. Again, the parts that are highlighted here were really kind of wrote for the Titanic data set. So it may or may not apply to your data set. So be very careful as you're looking through this. Make sure that you're choosing pieces of this that are relevant for you, and you have specific results, specific answers that are relevant to your particular data set. So I'll just draw your attention to that. In this document, I've kind of highlighted the blue parts compared to these parts here that are in black text are more the data that would be relevant for any project. You could definitely use this as a template and then decide on these other pieces. I do ask that it's, as Davenport standard is, that it's in APA format, so please make sure your document is in APA format. And if you do cite pieces, if you do it, in other words, if you take maybe a section of this, let's say dealing with outliers. Let's say if I wanted to copy this and then maybe modify this a little bit, you should note that it was taken from the course material, just to cover yourself as far as citing your sources, and have a works cited page on the back end of this. So this is the project proposal. This will eventually become the analysis document that you will use in week 14. For next week, I will show you an example of the Jupyter notebook that I would produce as a result of this, to be used out in complement for this. Any questions, please reach out on the discussion forums, through an email, or directly to your instructor, or come to the office hours. We'll be able to answer questions there. Thank you.